Give you the go. Yes, you're online. Let's go.
Is the sound okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay. Okay, so good afternoon or good morning or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the International Forum for Global South Studies. And now we will have a panel entitled Recreating Realities, Critical Praxis in Precarious Times. Thank you to all the presenters already. We will have first Carmen Irene González Menéndez from University of Tübingen, then Vanessa Schmitz from University of Prague and University of Tübingen, then Simone Zanello from University of Tübingen and Toulouse, and finally Samad Sabat from University of Toulouse and Complutense University Madrid. And first things first, we will have Carmen Irene González Menéndez from University of Tübingen. So Carmen holds a Master of Arts in Comparative Literature from the University of Halle, where she worked in the chair of Spanish and Latin American Literature and Cultural Studies. Since October 2024, she has been pursuing her PhD at the University of Tübingen at the Deutsche Seminar in the field of international literatures. And your presentation is entitled, Why Would People as a Whole Want to Exercise the Freedom to Arrange for the Upkeep of Other People and the Persistent Struggle for Epistemic Transformation in the Future Anterior? We will have your presentation and then Vanessa and then a first discussion. So the floor is yours, Carmen. You have until 3:45. Please try to stick to the time. Thank you.
I will. Thank you, Silvan, for the great introduction. This international forum as possible. And the title of my presentation I chose because I think it's a question, it's an interrogative appealing to the challenges we're facing today. And because also of the theme of the international forum being it making futures in precarious times, I think this is something we have to ask ourselves about the desire to want to have a shared future. Is there the desire to want to plan a shared future? And this citation of the title, why would people as a whole want to exercise the freedom, because it's supposed to be an uncoercive desire, right, to arrange for the upkeep of other people, meaning other forms of life. This citation is from Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's work, An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization. And I would quickly, thank you, if you can open the presentation and share the screen. I think we forgot to do this, and you have to share the screen, right? So the people in internet can also, sorry for the delay.
Yeah, sorry, my fault.
No, we're all learning, so it's no one's fault. So maybe, because I cannot see, thank you. Okay. So if you click one, the next, okay. If I can have the control, I have control. Okay, this table of contents. I would really quickly talk about the citation. Why is it? It's an opening to think about the epistemic past. We have to imagine a shared future. Then I will talk about the concept of the future anterior according to Spivak. I think Fernando Resende talked also about this yesterday a little bit, and maybe it has some similarities. And then at the end, I will present a reading I have been working on in my research of Las Negras. I don't know if you can see it. It's a work of the Puerto Rican author Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro. So the first quotation, it's a quotation from the work of Spivak, An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization. And there she offers this question as an interpretation of reading Marx, chapter number 50 of the Capital. Marx, it's maybe something we think it's outdated, but it's important to recognize it as common ground in the humanities. And it's also important to see alternative readings and interpretation of this important text. And in chapter 50, Marx writes on the Schein der Konkurrenz, so the appearance of competition. And he is writing about the role that variable capital plays in constituting the role that the surplus value can have for future making, right? So if we have a surplus in production, because we as a society produce something we can save, the decision we have to make is what do we want to make with this saving of production for the future life, right? So this is the quotation of Marx. I won't get in the depths of it, but the part I have highlighted is that Marx is talking about the form, the capitalistic form of surplus value, of variable capital, and of the intention of the capitalist, or the lack of intention of the capitalist, to invest the surplus value for social reasons, for social planning of the future. So he says at the end of this chapter, if finally both, one, the necessary labor that is needed to produce something, and the surplus labor, so that which is not anymore necessary, if these two things are taken to include the amount of labor that those capable of work must always perform for those that are not capable to work, so sick people, or elderly people, or children, if we stripe these both things from its capitalistic form, of its capitalistic characters, we would have then nothing of this form remaining, but simple those bases, he says in German, Grundlagen, of the forms that are communal, gemeinschaftlich to all social modes of production. So what Marx is saying here is the discussion we are always having to have, either in capitalist forms of organization or in other forms, is the discussion about what we are going to do with the surplus of production that we are producing as a social organization, right? So Spivak takes this point and says, Marx has not theorized the revolutionary subject, the socialist subject, so to say, but he is opening up an epistemic space to speak about how we want to plan future. So how is this future making going to be? And on this topic, she says, what is not given here is why people as a whole would want to exercise the freedom, remember, the uncoercive desire to arrange for the upkeep of other people. So the establishment of governments that enforce this are first, again, that reliance on abstract structure that we are questioning here. So normally it is the state that gives us the motivation to plan our future, but if we don't think about the states, then we have to think about this discussion, this communal discussion we are going to have always when we are talking about a shared future. And Spivak says, here is where we see this persistent struggle for epistemic transformation in the future anterior. So for her, the future anterior is a method, or better to say, a figure with which we can learn to work in a communal way, discussing the challenges of future making, right? So Spivak is mostly known for not being simple and for being really complicated. But I found two citations where she's talking about the future anterior as a grammatical category. And this can help us understand and imagine the concept of future anterior, right? So these are the two most simple citations I have ever found of Spivak. The first one is future anterior. What is it? It's something else will have happened, or to paraphrase it, the future anterior is something will have been when we plan as something will be. So this is a metaphor, if you will, a figure, if you will, a rhetorical figure, if you will, to understand the difficulties of future planning going in an efficient way, right? When we're talking about efficiency, in neoliberal terms, when we're planning future, there's always one plan for the future that has to happen from A to Z, right? And this kind of future anterior, what Spivak is talking about, is letting other affluences, other confluences come and vary the plan that we are going to. I have 7 minutes in my timer. I'm so sorry. Yeah, so this is something she opens up as a grammatical category. Yesterday, there was also talked about how grammar influenced our thinking, but you know, Spivak, in the tradition of Derrida and with grammatology, it is really important just to think about the graphical component of this opening of many affluences, kind of influencing the plans that I'm making for my future. So she talks about a genealogy of mistakes, trying to open up more variables that can be kept as long as possible for the future making. So instead of narrowing the variables that are going to find the future, we're trying to broaden up the variables that can be kept as long as possible for the future, right? And this is something that Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro, the Puerto Rican author, thematizes in her work. She just published this work, Las Negras. I don't know if the people in the internet can see it. I will give it around. It's a compilation of short stories. Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro is an Afro-Caribbean Puerto Rican author, and she first publishes Las Negras in 2016, talking about short histories of enslaved women and enslaved girls, and imagining the stories that this person lived on suffering and pain. Then she published 2024 Afro-Algoritmos, a sci-fi futuristic novel on Black Afrofuturism. And these both publications she then combined to make a new compilation trying to convey the histories of enslaved women in the past and the histories of Black women in the future in a kind of a sci-fi typification, so as to open something that we could read as future anterior. So I brought for you two passages, and this is the last thing I will read in the last 5 minutes. So the short story is called Mulatres, and it's about a person living in the future that falls in love with a machine, with a kind of an artificial intelligence, and the artificial intelligence decides to help her to plan her last memory before this person dies. And to plan this last memory, the protagonist has designed a plan called Mulatres, and it's supposed to be a circular plan that permits the stories of her Black ancestors to gain force to overcome slavery in the future, right? So we can read together, and I will read it in Spanish, since I think most of the audience also understand Spanish. So this is where the artificial intelligence is helping the protagonist to open up this digital plan to be the last memory before death. And she says, abro la secuencia del plano Mulatres en la pantalla y mi humana, antes de cerrar los ojos, me toma de la mano. En la pantalla, mi amada se convierte en Wanwe. Su nacimiento sucede en 1772. Corre a través de la selva africana intentando no ser capturada. Asesina a 3 de sus secuestradores, pero otros 7 sobreviven y la encadenan. La mantienen en cautiverio por 8 meses. En otra ocasión es Ndisi, políglota, asesina y salvadora de niños que mueren en la horca. Un día la bautizan en la fe católica, le cambian el nombre, ahora se llama Soledad. La suben a un barco que navega en alta mar por 130 días. El plano virtual corre casi 4 horas terrestres de sueño lúcido. Yo me quedo a su lado, acariciando su mano, acariciando su cuello, acariciando sus hombros. Cuando concluye el blueprint, ella deja de respirar por breve minuto. Luego, aspira con ahogo y abre los ojos. En medio de todos los rituales humanos, hacemos pausas y reiniciamos el Mulatres. Con cada nueva corrida, ella se hace más fuerte. I will skip some of this. And then, at the end of this passage, she says, mi humana siempre se queda sin respiración cuando concluye el preview del programa. No sé cómo detener la historia. No sé cómo evitar que Mulatres de Soledad muera. No quiero que mi ancestra muera en la eternidad. So here the story opens up the problem of trying to change time, trying to travel time, right? And then at the end, to spoil you the short story, I'm so sorry, at the end of the story, the artificial intelligence says, I don't know how to do this, so ni siquiera yo sé hacer esto. Digo, no puedo detener la ejecución del programa sin violar mi código base. No puedo salvar a Soledad sin destruirme a mí misma. Pero entonces una idea comienza a crecer en mí. Mientras ella duerme, accedo a los registros más antiguos de su linaje. Busco patrones, coincidencias, fragmentos olvidados y ahí lo descubro. Una anomalía, una brecha en el tiempo. Soledad no murió allí, dio a luz a una niña, pero hay algo más. Me reprogramo y creo un algoritmo que permite detectar las secretas historias orales interfamiliares. Con un leve desvío matemático y adjudicando variables de proyección, los antecedentes corrigen el silencio ancestral y permiten pronosticar numéricamente un acercamiento más fidedigno de lo que pudo haber sucedido. And here we have the end of the story where the artificial intelligence looks for a crack in the system, makes a new programmation, and talks about a better, more fidedign approach to that could have happened, right? So here we have the future anterior, and I think the plasticity, I hope the plasticity of the literary text help us understand this figure. And yeah, I at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Carmen. And now we have Vanessa Schmitz from the Universities of Prague, Czech Republic, and University of Tübingen, Germany. And I don't think I have a short video for you, sorry, but yeah, you are doing your PhD in between the two universities. And you can introduce yourself more if you want. And the floor is yours for 15 minutes too. Yeah, sorry, and your talk is entitled Doing Future in the Present, Pedagogical Reflections. Yeah. Yeah, and here you are the College of Fellows, right, in cultural theory, I guess, and in Prague you are in philosophy for your PhD, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, as Sibyl has already said, I'm doing my PhD here in Tübingen and yeah, between Prague and Tübingen. And since I guess we have a very short time, I will start. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be engaged in this urgent topic. We are already living in precarious times based on actions grounded on an agonal oppositional understanding of human and nature, individual and society, the better developed civilizations of the West, and the so-called primitive communities of the global South, and everywhere else than the traditional West.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think I don't know if the people, if they are here listen to you.
I don't know, can you hear Vanessa speaking?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, because you're not appearing on the image.
Or
I don't think
The cable?
Yeah, I don't think so. But maybe we change places. Do you want us to do this?
everybody appears.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, don't worry. Okay, not only in the past, but still we are facing practices of violence framed as neo-colonial violence, and like Nkrumah in 1965 and Segato and Zizek nowadays has framed this, taking humans and non-humans the capacities to be alive in a vivid and a life-taking sense. Since I consider that their structural as well as individual concretions are based on a specific self-understanding and fundamentally related to a pedagogy of cruelty, I will talk about doing future and present pedagogical reflections to argue that we can and need to do future and the present according to specific practices of raising, taking seriously that we literally create the sources for the future by raising those who already are and will become agents. Talking about raising, I will focus on a praxis of care, being engaged for human unfolding, taking place mutually, based on the way we encounter, aka treat each other. This also includes education nurturing, but is not reducible on knowledge or wisdom, rather constitutive for self-unfolding and a simultaneously individual, social, and environmental sense. With this, I will argue for a critically engaged recreation for our coexistence where the question to whom you refer with our is at stake. Talking about our reality, it is unavoidable that we are already facing precarious times. The most popular phenomena is the climate crisis, which obviously was framed as a crisis when humans recognized the existential insecurity going hand in hand with the climate change, a change already a process. Based on human behavior, exploiting natural and human resources for merely capitalistic and oligarchical interests rather than human needs, as we can see with Nkrumah, the climate crisis is fundamentally related to a specific anthropocentric, misanthropic self-understanding of humans, intentionally creating gaps and borders between humans to undermine the force of united communities and between nature and humans to win the war against nature. Thus, going hand in hand with colonial and neo-colonial practices and the commitment to violence as a tool to fulfill the Western paradigm, as legitimized by, for example, Kant, we can see that the climate crisis is created by a crisis of human behavior, based on the problematic engagement of humans for themselves, forced by capitalism, patriarchy, and colonial practices. More precisely, it is the one-sided self-centered paradigm of an individualistic, egoistic self-understanding as the individual in a singular sense being translated into a common behavior. Not only, but especially nowadays, we can find a new development of precarity arising from human self-understanding, intensified and used by neoliberalistic, capitalistic, and oligarchical interests. We recognize the growing misuse and reinforcement of othering in the privileged societies of Europe and America, grounded on nationalistic, misanthropic, and excluding paradigms, and translated, for example, into the debate about migration. Itself a misanthropic debate, taking the own privilege for granted or earned, and the most obviously in America, the limitation of scientific freedom being engaged in human self-understanding. But these are not only debates, but also translated in the exclusion of the unwanted. Simultaneously, this undermines their own impact on and engagement in wars really taking place in Africa as a result of colonial practices, while the forms of engagement in Ukraine and Gaza shows the self-centered force, especially of Germany. Thus facing today a merely murdering misinterpretation of human existence, destroying human and non-human lives from inside and outside, basically a practice of undoing relationality, undermining our fundamental human engagement. What we are facing is the crisis of human self-understanding and behavior, abusing several forms of lives for themselves, itself structurally octroyed and by that incarnated by humans with roots in Western paradigms, undermining the democratic engagement to care about life and its nuances. Taking seriously that we are the presence, hence we are forced to adopt or engage critically with current paradigms, as Merleau-Ponty reminds us, I consider that we need to counteract nowadays merely murdering misinterpretation of human existence, going hand in hand with the demand to denounce vulnerabilities, necessities, environmental responsibility, and social desire, and a strong relationship with a specific pedagogy. Forcing neoliberalism and patriarchy leaving remains instead of dead cops behind, to refer to Segato, instead of being engaged in a vivid life, as precisely argued by Segato. Regarding that the way humans are used to live is based on the initial encounters in their childhood, since these first encounters with others in the world not determined, but is the background for following images of the self, others, and the world, it is quite obvious and simultaneously nowadays merely underrated that we need to be critically and fruitfully engaged in pedagogical discussions. What we are facing usually is a fundamental ignorance of pedagogical issues or the determination of pedagogics on an epistemological level. Here, I don't argue against the importance of the epistemological level, but merely that this is based on and goes hand in hand with the way we treat and encounter children, since this is the ground how they experience and encounter themselves and others. Even nowadays, merely forced to get into labor than to be critically engaged via ways not to evolve as individuals in a human sense, but to be slaves for a system based on the aliens of neoliberalistic and patriarchal paradigms created by several practices of violence, going hand in hand with the possession of anthropocentric power and property. Thus, even nowadays, security is as such a cultural fact, basically related to a pedagogy of cruelty, as unfolded by Vito Segato, who stresses that it introduces a violence not only against women, but also against men, by demanding for a violent practice, especially of men, ways to fundamentally suppress their own vulnerability. This leads to the practice of violence of humans against themselves, each other, and nature, because the pedagogy of cruelty normalizes violence from the very beginning. As such, performed violence creates a landscape of cruelty, driven by a growing lack of empathy, undoing the relationality of humans and non-humans, which does not exist ontologically, but is the fundamental structure of human existence, as Escobar argues. This undoing of relationality recreates the landscape of violence we faced in the past and are facing currently, because with a lack of empathy, we don't care about the necessities of the other, since we are not attentive on them. This climate creates in the oppressor a strongly oppressive consciousness. Pierre makes the point. That is why the violent and violence-creating pedagogy of cruelty accustoms on the fragmentarization of the vivid, forces the individualistic power of some to suppress others, a structure which is also translated on other dimensions like nature. It steals us the breath we need for our voice and life, and determines our relationships into functions without a vivid core or interest for each other. As such, closing and freezing our eyes, hearts, and mouth, the pedagogy which still influences our reality undermines that we need to encounter us and creates experiences based on concrete actions. Existential experiences where you can fear to lose your life by being so harmed that you cannot find the space, energy, breath, or ability to live anymore. Living in a reality based on the suppression of feelings and the abuse of the boarding unconsciousness, where you trained to accept or ignore injustice since you earn what you get, we need to radically re-ask the question of our self-understanding, setting the lines for actions. Rather, understanding the human existence in the sense of the humus, as argued by Haraway and Hahn, thus related to the earth and the whole atmosphere, being the sources of our fundamental human engagement, and with being considering raising as the ground phenomena to create humanity in a concrete sense between humans and according to their self-image, which also includes the world. I think that we need a pedagogy of resistance, a pedagogy of becoming, driven by the will and desire to live and fight for life. Not a violent, but a careful fight with attentiveness to the concrete and the whole. Since we belong to the world as much as the world belongs to us, which means on a non-anthropocentric level that we are engaged in one atmosphere, as Emmanuel Kocher emphasizes, and makes us fundamentally responsible for each other, including the atmosphere and all participants. Especially nowadays, it is undeniable that we need a critical engagement in our proximity on philosophical and practical dimensions, which also needs to be translated into practices of raising. We should take seriously that, as Esquirol emphasizes in his Anthropology of Infinite Vulnerability, our proximity is the grounding source of our existence, which is the source of mutual and violent relationships, whereas we cannot totally avoid to harm each other, but are responsible in how far we do so. With the closing words, I would like to draw shortly the main dimensions of a pedagogy of resistance, not only allowing to encounter each other, but also to empower those whose voices are used to be muted or erased. First of all, it requires from us to unlearn and relearn, thus to unlearn what we are used to do, and to relearn to be critically engaged with our reality, with the attempt to create more vivid, open-minded, rather than excluding realities, since our individuality is in between of egocentric and social individuality, in being one and in being true. Something that that also needs to be translated into the political dimension. What we and our children need to learn is to look at and speak with each other, not to present oneself, but to really get into contact with each other. A dialogical practice, prominently practiced by Paulo Freire in Latin America, empowers to talk about own needs and desires, practices to listen and to respond to each other. Depending on the way it is practiced, it is neither automatically theological nor rationalistic, but merely something that takes place as an in-between of thoughts and feelings, sentimentos, as a thinking guided by the heart, is named in the indigenous language Tozil. As such, it can be a turning point to be focused on needs rather than capital economical worrying, and to get in contact to collectively transfer individual forces into a communal power to change the multidimensional murdering system from bottom up in relation to the in-between of concrete territories, humans, and other living beings. Based on new epistemologies, willing to learn from others, from other epistemologies, and from children, this can support a scream for life as a response to the birth, thus to the newborn, fundamentally an in-between of a new beginning and a historical embeddedness. Not introduced from above, but merely developed territorially, focusing on the necessities of people and their surroundings by paying attention to current phenomena, this can open an open mind and heart to not be stuck on their own territory, instead being willing to encounter others instead of as totally distant foreigners. Simultaneously, and not to undermine the potential power of the global south, but to take seriously the responsibility of us for each other, I consider that this pedagogy of resistance for life, not only for the global south, but also for European and American context, to take seriously the impact of colonial practices merely based on paradigms we can already find in these contexts. Obviously, we cannot change the whole system by a recreation of practices of raising, but in the best case, we can undermine the walls of the neo-colonial, patriarchal, and hegemonial oligarchical system by one structure, which used to support the system, but can create cracks into the already standing system to overcome the curing walls, since one crack has the capacity to break the wall, even when it's already failing, thus falling. That, to quote, the current rise of illiberal, xenophobic liberalism, zero-interest capitalism, and ecofascism, concurrent with the collapse of a unipolar US power, may be signaling a new reorganization of neoliberalism, as Povinelli writes, opens the possibilities to be turned into a social liberalism, caring for the replication for life in a broader sense, including human and non-humans. For this, our practices of raising matters in relation to and beyond the epistemological dimension, since it is one structure that shapes our interests and engagement from the very beginning. We have to be aware of the fact that this does not turn back processes of climate change, colonialism, and other forms of violence, unnecessarily introduced by humans to suppress others. But what we can change is how we treat our human and non-human surroundings now, for whom and what we feel and act responsibly, and in how far we are willing to learn from other perspectives. Not only for myself, but merely and foremost for ourselves. That's neither harmonious nor easy, but undeniable if we finally put life over capitalistic interest and thirst for egoistic power. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa. We've got 10 minutes left for the first Q&A, and we already have a question from Komivi. So Komivi, feel free to put your camera on if you like it, and your microphone, and we are listening to you. We don't hear you at the moment, Komivi. Or it was a mistake, maybe, I don't know. Okay, if anybody else has questions, comments, reflections about the first two papers, yes, Christian?
Yeah, thank you so much for your paper, your presentation. I actually have a comment for Carmen. Well, yeah, more than a question or a question. But do you know what? Actually, the first thing that I thought when we started to explain us the thing is the famous hubiera that we have in Spanish.
Like,
Yeah, it's for me. Yeah, you told me. Yeah, it's too complicated. Yeah, I mean, when you were speaking about this, it's like hubiera, and we tried. The hubiera is like the. It's
two different. I mean, please finish your question, but
it's like we always use hubiera
the condition,
hubiera
right?
hecho,
Yeah.
and the angle mostly is el hubiera no existe, no? The hubiera doesn't exist, but exists in a way. I mean, I was just thinking about it and how we also like language exactly is the mechanism for that, and how it also like not just in a way define our everyday life, but also exactly the something like it's there and I was like, yeah, just thinking about it. And thank you very much for
No, thank you for the question. It's actually great because I think the power of this concept of future anterior is not only the philosophical dimension, but the quotidian or everyday life dimensions. So what I like about this expression or these literary passages can help us really imagine what it's about. It's about, because I didn't say this, you saw I rushed into the presentation, but the story of these former slave women is being put in the future in a science fiction way, where there is a society where the well-being of every human is already taken care of. So you can go, you can be as old as you want, you can choose your death, but still in this position of wealth, so to say, you will still keep thinking about it happening in the past and why it happened. And the artificial intelligence is a metaphor for this trying to replay until you can find the cracks. And I think you mentioned this also in your presentation, right? These cracks where we can put the epistemological to work so that we can think that, and someone said this yesterday, yeah, I guess it was Fernando Rosales, the future of today, the present today, was the future of models that were in the past. So why? And where can we find the analogy of mistakes maybe? So it's something just to think about. Thank you so much, Christelle.
Any other question, comments? Maybe I have one for Vanessa. Thank you, both of you, by the way, for your presentations. And I was wondering if you could maybe develop more about Rita Segato and the question of counter-pedagogies and counter-violence, because we had many discussions about violence and counter-violence these last days. So maybe could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, what I find very interesting that she, as we have already talked about that in the last days, that she makes this really nice difference between violence and cruelty by arguing that, of course, there's violence taking place, especially in the nature and between us and the nature. But when it comes to cruelty, this is literally a dimension introduced by humans, and as such, related to a specific understanding of the human, as Segato said, or as I have to refer to Segato, based on neoliberalism and patriarchy. And what I find very interesting is that she has an attempt to argue that violence does not only this cruelty is not only taking place against women but also against men, and that we as a whole, let's say, united human community, that we have to care about this point.
Thank you. And Juliana, if on Zoom you have questions and comments, feel free to raise your hand and or to talk directly after. Juliana?
And thanks very much, you both, for your presentation. It was really interesting I think you have like a common ground talking about reflection on theory, on literature theory, and on pedagogics theory. And you show us like some cases with Yolanda Radio. And yesterday, or well, this week too, you show us with another Colombian writer. And I would like to ask Vanessa if you have, this is the part of your thesis, and if you have some examples of movements of becoming pedagogy or resistance pedagogy that you work in your corpus, or how do you analyze that? And if you can tell us more about it, please.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I guess this is very important according to the point, because you could argue, okay, where does this power come from? How do we imply this power which needs to be moved by the will of life, for example, or let's say like this. And I see we can already see some of these movements. What I found very interesting, it was Eva von Redeker, who wrote such a beautiful book, and she this was literally there she talked about, for example, Fridays for Future, which is just one example, or also Black Lives Matters. And I guess there you can really see how communities driven by a specific interest and coming together, really in the sense of Hannah Arendt, by coming together can create something and can open our eyes on topics which were not even on the table. And I mean, okay, now unfortunately the politics tries to go beyond the attempt of Fridays for Future, but the discussion and the point is on the table, and it's undeniable. So I guess this is a really nice example in how far this already takes place, and I guess we have to emphasize this by this pedagogy of resistance.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, and just to finish, I find a place, just the common ground there, just in this constitutional language. This I forgot the name, but the surname is Rocha, who is a theoretian, and he talks about literature and how literature help us to build a new system, to build a new logic, to build a new idea.
And it's about imagining alternatives, although the alternative concept is in Germany, it's coined, but I think you're bringing Eva von Redeker. It's really important because she writes the Revolution for Life, and also then the Bleibefreiheit. I don't know the name in English, but the point of this is also she also cites a lot of Rita Segato. And I think she's one of the authors working with Rita Segato really on an eye-to-eye level in Germany, and this is really important because she's talking about, and I tried to apply this on my case study. Are we narrowing the possibilities of life, or are we broadening the possibilities of life? So are we walking towards life, or are we walking towards death? And Segato will say this when she says there's the project of the objects, of the vínculo, of the attachment to the objects, and there is the project of the attachment to the human. She talks about the humans. She doesn't really explicitly talk about the non-human, but it's still implicated, So if we're talking about the project of the attachment to humans, to subjects, to persons, then we're talking about the diversification of life, right? And so I think, thank you so much for bringing this up, because this made me think about when you're talking about pedagogy of resistance. Resistance means keeping the modes of life that are endangered to be narrowed, to be, how do you say, suppressed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wu, you had raised your hand, but would you agree if you keep your question or comment for later, or because if you want to stick to the abstract capitalist time, we should now have Simone's presentation. But if you prefer, you can say very shortly your question now, Louis, or you keep it for later. It's up to you. we cannot hear you at the moment. Yeah, maybe say it shortly. And activate your microphone.
Yes. Hello.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can.
Hello.
No, thank you very much. I've heard the presentation as for as for pedagogical reflection. I would like to ask a question. What could be the means to palliate, to cope with crisis of human self-understanding and behavior? What could be the means to palliate, to cope with such a kind of crisis of human being self-understanding and behavior? As for pedagogical means, that is my question.
Yeah, thank you. When I understand your question right, I would answer with the point that pedagogy is unfold or was, as Rita Segato has already shown us, was the reason why we are facing this, as she writes, this landscape of violence. And thus, I guess to take this seriously, we don't have to deny pedagogy because it is a ground phenomena of human life. And then I don't argue that we need a civilized community. This is not my case, but much more argue that it really depends how we raise our children and how we encounter them, how we include them in our reality. And again, if we make the hard difference between the adults on the one side and the children on the other side, the teacher standing from above and teaching the children from above what they need to learn, or if they are allowed to be critically engaged, to think by themselves, and also to be allowed to raise questions and thus to create common situations, and by that really learning how this communal aspect can support their common interests.
Valeria, could you keep maybe your question for
it's not.
or very
It's
shortly?
a question, yeah.
Okay, very shortly.
They also Christelle just told me, and I was like, yeah, that's true. We are going to have also a panel about communality and pedagogies of resistance, because we had a wonderful panel here in Tübingen. And I think that it also works like an example of counter pedagogy of the cruelty, but also in some performance from feminist activists and how you can unlearn the cruelty. And so that was a comment also for how performance and also symbolic arts and creating together in proximity the constructive learning of the cruelty. That was just one.
Thanks a lot. So now we have Simone Zanello. Simone, you are a PhD student in co-tutelle, double degree between the universities of Tübingen and Toulouse. And in Tübingen, you are in Cultures of the Global South with Dr. Nils Weidmann, and in the College of Fellows. And in Toulouse, you are at the Erasmus Research Center with Professor Dr. Elsa Dorlin. And in the German-French Doctoral College, New Critical Theories and Decentered Epistemologies. And your talk is entitled The Psychopolitics of Time, from Colonial Capitalist Temporal Dislocation to Futurability. The floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Will time myself. Thank you. Salary, shifts, productivity, management of your daily habits, efficiency, but also getting older, investing in your future, finding a secure job, building a family, getting married, having a baby. In short, living, surviving, and dying within a well-defined and apparently unescapable social, cultural, and economic order is a question of time, and in turn, a question of time. As brilliantly elucidated by Michel Foucault in La naissance de la biopolitique, the capacity to effectively allocate your mental, physical, and material resources is also affected by the ability to take into account time as determining factor. After all, biopolitical is that order that grasps life in its biological determination, that is, in its radically material and calculable finitude as political object. The sovereign power to put someone to death, to decide over the living and dying of someone, is substituted by an obsession for life itself, subsumed by the epistemological scheme of biology. The disciplinary greed at play in this subsumption provides a precise tool for calculating every aspect of living itself, exponentially increasing the amount of factors accountable for the determination of one's success, productivity, and personal realization. To put it simply, biopolitics, strictly linked with the neoliberal order, seems to finally achieve the dream of a rigorous, scientifically describable, and biologically enforceable recipe for success. Life is not anymore inexplicably subjected to the arbitrary forces of chaos. With the right amount of strength, calculation, and entrepreneurial mentality, everyone can be the master of his or her own future. However, an evident downplay of this line of reasoning is that failure, rather than being a misfortune or an assemblage of unfavorable conditions, becomes an individual fault. It is not surprising then to see an everlasting epistemological continuity between neoliberalism and social Darwinism. In its biopolitical dimension, neoliberal order can only shift the shame of having failed on individuals, on their incapacity to adequately account for all the factors that now, thanks to biopolitics itself, can be known, controlled, and managed to maximize the probability of living a successful, satisfying, and worthy life. When you have the full picture of what you should do, not doing it is the fault of lazy people. And when it comes to life, taking advantage of the opportunity to know the perfect timing will be determining for how you will live your entire time. I'm probably giving you anxiety. In a certain sense, it was precisely my goal. It must be frustrating coming to a conference about the future and finding a guy, me, remembering you of all the occasions in which you find yourself thinking, am I wasting my time? Do I have time to do this or that? Is it worth my time, or am I spending adequately my time? But my sadistic opening is only a way to go in another direction. Frantz Fanon thematized very effectively something I usually refer to as the colonial trauma. Confronting the work of Octave Mannoni, Fanon harshly criticized this work and this notion of complex inferiority. The complex of inferiority is a psychic complex of self-devaluation, a tendency to consider one's own self as inferior, unvaluable, and miserable in comparison to others. Mannoni apparently observed this tendency in the people of Madagascar, declaring that the inferiority complex was innate to them, inscribed in their psychic structure since birth. According to Mannoni, the psychological enterprise of the colonizer consisted therefore in the simple exploitation of this always already present complex for the imperialistic, economic, and geopolitical interests of the empire. In Benoît Mas-Blanc, Fanon famously argued for a temporal dislocation of the inferiority complex. According to him, if it is possible to observe this complex in certain cases of colonization, it is completely arbitrary to postulate its innate nature. Not only nothing allows Mannoni to indicate the inferiority complex as inscribed in the psyche of the colonized, but moreover, the same operation mystifies and silences the true timing of colonization. It is not the inferiority complex to facilitate the colonial domination, but is the colonial encounter with its violent intention of total submission and annihilation to make possible the constitution of an inferiority complex. It's the continuous humiliation, torture, and unrelentless violence of any kind and form to eventually determine the submissive, dismissive, or defeated attitude of a people. What interests me here is Fanon's operation reveals at least three things. One, modern colonial discourse has always been obsessed by time and its management. Two, time is a psychic issue. And three, time is at the same time a political issue. In Notes on the Post-Colonial, Ella Shoat offers a convincing and complete description of the nexus between modernity, coloniality, and capitalism. From this perspective, it is useful to recur to Fanon's analysis precisely because it reveals a common obsession of modern colonial discourse in its intertwinement with the genesis and structure of capitalism itself. The political management of biological life in its material finitude through its social engineering investment of maximization takes into account time in a very similar way, since even in this case, time is a psychic and political issue, an issue that constantly haunts not only the neoliberal rationality, but the entire capitalistic system of production, as the historical example of Fordism and Taylorism eloquently suggests. Isn't, after all, the very existence of tools such as obligations to entertain an essential relationship with time as both their condition of existence and their location of realization? Isn't, even more radically, the very first act of lending something to imply both time and the psychological expectation related to promising? In Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher emphasizes this intertwinement of the psychic and the temporal real within the current capitalistic and neoliberal order. According to Fisher, the obsession for time as political and psychic issue has always been central to capitalism in general and to neoliberalism in particular. If, as I said at the beginning, managing time is a central issue for surviving as individuals, this is even more true for societies, economic regimes, and political orders. In one of his most famous essays, Louis Althusser lucidly raised this question in terms of social reproduction as the tendency of every society to survive and continue to live. Following Fisher, then, the social reproduction of neoliberal capitalism is guaranteed by its capacity to cancel alternative timelines, something he effectively calls the slow cancellation of the future. Far from diminishing the role of oppression, capitalist realism is a formulation that suggests how capital has always engaged an operation of permanent occupation of psychic time, not only rendering unpracticable alternative ways of living and new modes of political organization, but even more radically, making unthinkable any other option different from itself. The horizon of the thinkable, which is definitely the horizon of the future, is permanently and preemptively foreclosed, and every operation of temporal dislocation, colonial and financial, for example, testifies both for the immense ability of capital in what I would call time hacking and for the extent of its capacity for self-reproduction. Even more radically, it is probably time hacking itself that constructs the very mechanism of capital's self-reproduction. We are then in presence of time hacking as a psychopolitical issue. A psychopolitical issue, however, allows a psychopolitical response. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engel's notion of historical materialism, while being a framework for historical analysis, is also functional in elucidating the shift, stating that what determines the historical deployment are the material economic conditions of society, or even more precisely, the productive system constituted by the entire complex of determined productive relationship of a given particular historical epoch, is not only a Marxist take on the ontology of history as such, but also the insistence on this history as materially constituted and therefore materially determinable, changeable, and transformable. Avoiding to consider history as a series of given facts is what allows to elucidate its own historicity, that is, its radically temporal dimension and then the finitude of each historical period. That's what I would also call its politicity, or the political possibility to concretely impact history, to challenge and disrupt its material configuration, and to actively engage in its transformation. This line of reasoning finds a perfect formulation in Georgi Lukács' comprehension of historical materialism, situated in the context of the historical struggle of the working class to overcome capitalism, where it serves exactly as both the theoretical framework and the practical tool to counter reification, the ideological grasp of an history considered as established, already given, and immutable set of facts. Returning to psychopolitics with an historical materialist perspective, then, means contesting the individual and private nature of the psychic dimension. In clinical terms, psychopolitics is whenever we start considering anxieties, depression, or disillusion not anymore as private issues, coming from inexplicable secret sources, or raising from biochemical processes separated and unrelated to the material condition of society in which we live. Even more, psychopolitics whenever we start feeling our emotions as directly connected with the political dimension of our life, or with Gilles Deleuze in his reading of Spinoza, whenever our affects are comprehended as flows acting across the entire stratified social body. In a reciprocal contamination, psychopolitics call for the urgency of considering the psychic political and the political psychic. traveling the lines originally dividing the two realms, and in this way making thinkable and practicable paths to move out of the actual social and economic order. Given what I said, opening this presentation, in the actual historical conversion of psychopolitics faces the construction and the deployment of a nonlinear time by the nexus of colonial, neo-colonial, and capitalist neoliberal asset of power relationships. This nonlinear time is put in place as intersection of economic exploitation of the working class, cultural erasure of indigenous people, political domination of the global south, among many other phenomena. In short, it is the nonlinear time of colonial, neo-colonial, capitalistic, neoliberal world, where levels of oppression are wisely intertwined to guarantee the existence and reproduction of this given historical convergence. After all, it is the time of oppression in its many interconnected modes of functioning. For having an adequate psychopolitical comprehension of this nonlinear time, it is useful to recur to schizoanalysis. In the attempt to construct a materialistic psychiatry, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari constructed schizoanalysis as the proper framework for navigating and eventually escaping the level of advancement the capitalists reached after the Second World War. According to Deleuze and Guattari, history moves at waves of psychic libidinal investment, resulting in corresponding movements of deterritorialization and re-territorialization. The establishment of a territory, the codification of a lower code, the surpassing of the same codification, and the reestablishment of another one, fully decodified and free-flowing, without any apparent limit, or are events resulting from the interaction of such dynamics. Different rhythms for different movements collapsing onto each other and generating new historical convergences. Very schematically, deterritorialization corresponds to every movement where previous codes, rule, or even material compounds are decodified, surpassed, or escaped, giving life to something new. Reterritorialization, on the contrary, is every attempt to arrest, subsume, or control the deterritorializing movement itself to the establishment of limits, or, as happens in capitalism, the constant shift of these limits in order to not make them reachable. Deterritorialization and reterritorialization as the two poles of historical movement correspond respectively to psychosis and neurosis as the two psychic poles of libidinal investment. On one side, the schizophrenic psychotic direction of deterritorialization is not metaphorical, since it tends to efface the limits, breaking the conventional codes and constructing multiple words. On the other, the neurotic direction of reterritorialization is the symptom of fascist, conservative, and reactionary attempts to reinstate a previous state of things. A psychopolitics of colonial capitalistic time is able to comprehend the arrested schizophrenic non-linearity of its movement. This non-linear time of capital, product of the strategic use of schizophrenics and neurotics libidinal investments, apparently foreclose any opening of a future different from the timeline we are currently living in. The slow cancellation of future is then a clear sign of a successful operation of time hacking. As Mark Fisher puts it, quoting Margaret Thatcher, "There is no alternative" is always the most succinct and effective slogan of capitalist realism, its capacity to efface and prevent any alternative to itself in the future. The question with which I would like to close this presentation, leaving some room and material for discussion, is then how to reopen a future in this context, how to do this from a psychopolitical perspective, how to surpass the capitalistic schizophrenic limit as line of escape from capital itself. Franco Pippo Berardi's concept of futurability is particularly productive in this sense. Futurability is the ability to have future, the degree of opening to future allowed within a determinate historical libidinal conjuncture. However, under the sign of both historical materialism and schizoanalysis, futurability is something we can learn and do, an ability that we can apprehend and a capacity that we can enact. Maybe collectively desiring futurability, that is, collectively reclaiming and enacting alternative times of being, of living, of relating to each other and to other forms of life, is the starting point for following the schizophrenic historical process furtherly. Breaking through the nonlinear time of capital, then, requires to strengthen, beyond any previous limit, our operations of time action.
Thanks a lot, Simone. for sticking to time. And now we have our last paper before the final discussion. Samar Sabat, so you are a PhD student in co-tutelle between University Toulouse Jean Jaurès et Rafis Research Center in Philosophy with Professor Dr. Oya Bentouami and Complutense University Madrid. I don't know your other supervisor there.
De Salvador Agra.
And the title of your paper is The Agony of Return Through the Lens of a Feminist Linguistic Performativity. The floor is yours for 15 minutes. Thank you. Do you have a PowerPoint?
No.
You
No,
don't
I
have?
don't.
Okay.
So, I begin. Exile is a trial. Such is the lesson that we learn with Odysseus. A trial that becomes a process of transformation. One that shapes, that constructs and deconstructs the identity of the exiled. Céline Flecheux, in her book on return, by bringing up the metaphor of the prodigal son, she speaks about, in general, about Ulysses and makes also the link between exile, return, and working on the figure of Ulysses. So by bringing up the metaphor of the prodigal son, she sees in such a transformation a journey and a process that takes place from a rupture, after a rupture from the familiar. A rupture that is not simply physical, but also temporal and psychological. Returning to Ithaca, Ulysses is not the same anymore. Exiled for a decade, he returns transformed after having faced many trials through his encounters. He is not the same man again. He is not the same man who finds himself obliged to take back his role as king, as a husband after a long absence. Just like the prodigal son, exile is a state of constant flux, never fixed, so to say. Nonetheless, even though, as we recall with Edward Said's argument on exile, literature and history contain heroic, glorious, even triumphant episodes, this is a mere endeavor to overcome the crippling sorrow of estrangement. This is a quote from Said. To return. That's how Lina Mirwane's book, starts her book. On the verb to return, telling us her story about her own return to the land of her ancestors in her book Palestine in Pieces, Palestina en Pedazos, as if the possibility of Palestine is thought in terms of the verb to return, a borrowed return, one that is constantly negotiated, never guaranteed, returning in place of her father, even her grandfather, which she would not consider her own, but one that is borrowed in the place of ancestors. Borrowed returns. Such are her words to describe her return in the place of. For their return was not possible. So was the case of her father, who during one of their visits to Egypt fixes his eyesight, his aging eyes, as she describes it, towards the east, towards a far place where he could see Palestine. Perhaps such is the destiny. And then she quotes Edward Said at the first beginning of her book. Perhaps this is the destiny of the Palestinian. In a way, it's sort of the destiny of Palestinians not to end up where they started, but somewhere unexpected and far away. Lina Mirwane's father, just like the Greek Odysseus, is still taken by the deeply rooted desire for home. Not far from being a universal experience, longing for home, his passage towards home is brimming with trials and dangers. Speaking of Ulysses, pitied by all gods, let alone Poseidon, his journey lasts for years and seasons. He is ordained with cold and rough weather before he is driven ashore on his own land. Though he is not killed by the latter god, he is relentlessly shoved away from returning home. There is also a Paraiba inscription telling the story of a Venetian inscription of a poem carved on stone, was found in northeastern Brazil in 1872. The poem recounts the story of 10 ships reinforced by Sidonians that sailed through the Red Sea around the southern tip of Africa and intending to cross the Gibraltar. However, the ship is cast to a distant shore with 12 men and 3 women on board. Having sailed from Saida city, the city of the king, and having set off in the sea for 2 years and roamed around the land of Ham, the admiral Abdashtarot addressed the gods and aspiring for a safe return, which does not forbid him from scrutinizing the man am I, the admiral, that I should flee. Defending the authenticity of the inscription, Gordon gives a glimpse into the translation of the Messianic inscription. The admiral, though he seems eager for a safe return after the separation of the ship from the other by the hand of Bag, the god Bag, believes he is not the kind of leader who gives up and tries to come back home. For he also says, "Does a man like me flee?" Just like the Odyssey, the brief poem of the Phoenician admiral is a prompt into an account of the quest of what Celine Fisher calls tours and detours before a possible return, one that may have recounted 1,000 turns. A man describes in Greek by the adjective polytropos in reference to the steep tours and detours geographically, physically, and metaphorically impregnated in the narrative of the voyage of return of Ulysses. The ultimate return, according to Fisher, the exile finds home, is changed just like he is, for which reason nostalgia for her is a lure. The Palestina in Pedazos, Palestine in Pieces by Lina Zelwane is a book mainly and foremost one on return. As to the opening of if we are to understand return as a linguistic and performative act, then Palestinian women's narrative becomes part of the wider Arab feminist movement. Return is not only a statement, it is an utterance, here an act in language, confronting exile as much as colonial and patriarchal structure. It invites us to ask, how can language of return be received as a performative resistance in the face of exile, patriarchy, and colonialism? So I quoted one of the also feminists, Palestinian Lebanese feminists during end of 19th, beginning 20th century, May Ziadeh, on equality, her book on equality. She quotes Michelet at the beginning of her book, which also summarizes the topic of her book on equality. Who can save me from the cruelty of discrimination? One can fantasize on or perhaps revel in a possible symbolic performative of feminist return, a return symbolic enough to reflect upon Palestinian and Arab feminism, exile, and language as a resistant performative of freedom, justice, and equality. In a state of mind where a Palestinian woman confronts and divides, and I'm quoting Kerbokian, a Palestinian feminist, she said that a Palestinian woman confronts and defies biopolitical, geopolitical, and necropolitical Zionist settler colonialism, as well as socio-patriarchal oppression. So returns goes beyond the physical coming back to a land. Return becomes a feminist statement, not a descriptive claim of fact, not true or false in Austin's considered sense, but a performative of exile. If one is to question with Austin whether saying can make it so, then return in the narrative of women is an act of resistance, and equally an act of dispossession and oppression. In Bina Das terms, she speaks about social suffering in her book from the perspective of feminist, the philosophy of feminist language. When we descend into the ordinary, she calls it that we have to descend into the ordinary of this narrative. So return becomes a performative of exile within the everyday language of women and ordinary, shaped by colonialism and patriarchy. Under a masculinist and militarized colonial siege, Palestinian women's forms of life, speaking of Wittgenstein and ordinary, are under siege too. Their voices are continually disrupted by an Orientalist Zionist discourse, forcing their narratives into exile and language. We come back to the story of Mirwane, to the question, who are you, as a linguistic performative, as she, before telling the story, she is a daughter of immigrants. She starts her journey to her grandparents' natal land, where she calls her return as a return in the place of others. No sería un volver, sino apenas un visitar a una tierra en la que nunca estuve. Lo palestino ha sido siempre para mí un rumor de fondo. No sería un regreso mío, sería un regreso prestado, un volver en lugar de otro, de mi abuelo, de mi padre. Her question goes beyond the curiosity about identity. It reflects what Said calls the unhealable rift between a human being and a native place, the crippling sorrow of estrangement. So she wonders in which language she would speak with her family as she encounters a cousin, an aunt. Her name is Mariam, and her father recommends her to call her, and she doesn't know in which language she says. She was in southern Chile, so she can speak with her in Spanish. So as they speak, she says, "Who are you? Marhaba, who are you?" And then after a silence, she starts saying, "Okay, family." And she repeats family several times. She repeats the word family several times, followed by laughter and blends of estrangement and confusion. So language and exile are not merely spatial, they are intellectual and emotional straits, trying to explain what we think we are, who we think we are, through a lost language. Y yo trato de explicarle quién creo soy, quién creo ser. Mirwana's book thus offers a glimpse into language, both as a container of trauma and a possible tool of redemption, a way to reclaim the self from the abyss of exile. I am reminded of a similar moment in my family where somebody knocked at the door, and my mom, she called that there was somebody speaking Spanish, and there was a middle-aged couple, and then they were like, somos primos. And they got the documents from the church, they got documents from Bolivia, and then just to tell us we are family from that grandfather, from a certain grandfather. So return as performative resistance. In exile, as Said writes, is not only loss and displacement, but also loss of identity and belonging. Then the act of return, especially for women, becomes both linguistic and political. Said reminds us that the exile suspended between worlds may transform that estrangement into moral and intellectual integrity, just as Cassin defines exile as hybrid, never entirely home, like Ulysses. Ulysses, upon finally reaching Ithaca, does not recognize it, nor is he recognized by anyone except by his dog. This is the paradox of the Nostos, the home that changes as we do. Austin's question, can saying make it so, becomes crucial here. When women say return, they are doing something, performing resistance through language. The illusionary force of return lies in its doing. It transforms estrangement of claim into a claim of belonging. Judith Butler, drawing on Althusser's inspiration, reminds us that speech has the power to constitute subjects. Injurious speech, for instance, he focuses on injurious speech, like racial profiling at airports, constructs identity through violence, but counter speech can reclaim it. And in one of the chapters, Mirwane, in this chapter, she calls it cicatriz, scar. We can see this, and she tells us how as she arrives at an Israeli airport security. She says that she's interrogated, her body is inspected, her name suspected, and her Jewish friend later jokes, "You are a real Palestinian now." So humor becomes survival and a counter-performative. When her relative Mariam says, when shall you return? And then she repeats, inshallah. The word, may God will. The word carries both hope and despair as a linguistic performance of mourning. The unhealable rift between person and home is indeed crippling, yet as Said notes, it can be artistically transformative. Through language, the exile reconstructs shattered histories and imagined homes. The force of language, its elocutionary and perlocutionary effects, not only dismantle but also reconstitutes identity. Vina thus calls this being finally given a home in language, a process where memory and narrative reclaim justice. To be given home in language is thus both an epistemic and moral act. It restores voice and under conditions of colonial silencing. As Nahla Abdo also reminds us, our belief in dialogue at the grassroots and intellectual levels remains the only path toward true peace. Addressing exile through language is an act of epistemic justice, of achieving epistemic justice, reclaiming meaning from the structures that erase it. The narrative of return as performativity. Maysa Yadeh herself, Palestinian and Lebanese, embodies this return in language, asking, "Where is my homeland?" She performs belonging through writing. Kassan might call this included otherness. We are all exiles, she says, Barbara Kassan. Rome, Kassan reminds us, was built by the foreigner Aeneas, exile as origin. The Origo ritual reenacted foreigners annually, linking Rome's identity to an ancestral elsewhere. Language, like empire, both includes and excludes. Derrida's notion of hospitality reminds us that welcoming the other always risks misunderstanding. So, Maysa yearning for equality is thus a yearning for home, a home in language. Just like Aeneas fleeing Troy, or the Phoenician admiral praying for return, exile becomes a universal human condition. Kassan, like Said, reminds us that the hegemonic languages, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and English, are performative of sovereign power, naming, declaring, banning. There are speech acts that create reality. Authority is not given, it is performed repeatedly. Merwani exposes this through nomenclature. Hebron al-Khalil, transformed by Zionist renaming. That's what she says, Lina Merwane. The city divides as she visits this city. The city is divided not only by territory, but also by language. More than nomenclature, it's a dispute of memory and territory. Naming becomes politics. For her and for us, exile is also exile in language. For borrowed return becomes a questioning. Who are you? Answered through a fragile laughter that reveals the limits of speech. Yet even when she decides never to return, her Jewish Arab friend insists, never say you shall not return, Merwane. You shall return soon. So to conclude, Nostos and Nos, return and mind, meet in this idea. To return is not only to go back, but to rethink, to reconstruct oneself through language. From Homer's Odysseus to Maysa Yadeh to Lina Merwane, return is both longing and resistance, a feminist and political performative, an act of speech that feels, protests, and remembers. It is through saying that return becomes possible, not as geography, but as language.
Thanks a lot, Samar and Simone and the others too. And now we have theoretically 7 minutes left for discussions. Maybe we can make a bit more, I don't know. So the floor is open also for you on Zoom and for you in the room, of course. Yeah, Christian.
I have just a curiosity question. Do you talk to each other to build this panel? Because I think all the papers are really related, and it's really nice to have this different voices, perspective, I don't know, a concept to speak about future. I think it's really nice, and I really thank you all of you for this presentation. I think I have just more ideas, and I agree with. I mean, you both were speaking about languages, and I also work with literature, so I really thankful. Grateful for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. It was a beautiful teamwork, so thanks to you all, because Nana invited me to organize panels, but then we really discussed together to find a title, for example, Recreating Realities, Critical Praxis in Precarious Times, So we really tried to read each other's abstracts and to think about resonances.
Yeah, it's really a good job. I actually wanted to remind as well what Valeria was saying about, because I think we were more focused on the concept of this idea of pedagogy, and we have this the work of this amazing professor from Colombia called Adolfo Habana Chinte. We will participate next week with in a table with Valeria and Laura, two colleagues of our department here. And he will be speak about his work and work he did here in May. He was here in April.
Yeah, we made the painting in the castle. Will you be there back in Christmas?
No, online.
Online. Okay.
I don't know if there's point that I listen to both of you and I want to comment or ask maybe a little bit like because Simon, when you explain all the psychopolitics of time, I think that it was really interesting, all the connections and all the authors. And also with you, I think that we are living just this process of returns that are not able to talk about. And at the same time, I found like a connection. But it's like, my question is a little bit like how this acceleration in the case of the psychopolitics and this idea of everything should be extremely fast, we should be like in a lot of places at the same time, but at the same, in the case of the return, it's the other part. It's just like you are extremely slow and you are repeating the things just like 10 times because maybe there's an experience of trauma. And how these times are entangled and we are able to see them also across the media and all that information. How can we deal with this technologies industry, because it's there and we are facing that every day. And I don't know if you have think also about a connection between this, because there's just like this feeling of fascination of, oh, okay, I'm going to watch a new thing and I'm going to go and swap. And in the other also, it's just like how to come back territorializing in the space. And it's about time, language, but also how you think that it could be like, because we're in the same room now, but at the same time, it's like together, but with different times or three.
Yeah, but that is something like, if I understand your question, this is a very creative question, I guess. Return is not necessarily return to the past, and that's why Edward Said, he says that nostalgia is a faulty concept because it doesn't allow us to work the present at the same time. That's what you meant, right?
Yeah.
It's return to something
Because it doesn't necessarily anymore.
No.
We also don't have the words return.
Exactly. So that's why we also, and even like the other authors like Barbara Dessin and Fleischer, they agree also. Their writings are similar in that sense, in the sense of nostalgia. We do not return to the past because we need to work the present, but return as a concept of justice, I would say, more or less.
Or resistance.
Or resistance.
Yeah, I agree. I would only say that probably the fact is that in my presentation is exactly about, in a certain sense, I would say it's not exhaustive, but there is a movement of return. It's exactly the fact that it's not only that capital from today determines the future, but that from the future determines today. Saying that there is no alternative, It's not only from now to the future. It means traveling in time in a certain sense, from my perspective. So how can we oppose or be able to oppose an adequate movement of return that not only from today says how the future should be, but it's able to travel to the future, to open the future and then materialize it in the present. It's always good. Those both ways.
Yeah, I think this also resonates in both of your papers with Ayrton Krenac's ancestral futures idea. And it reminds me that even, I think it was even Ayrton Krenak, he wrote a book called Ideas to Stop or to Postpone the End of the World. But then he discussed, I think with Schopenhauer or with another indigenous thinker, and the other one told him that maybe we have to endure the end of this colonial capitalist patriarchal world in order for other worlds to emerge. So I don't know, but I think that maybe this is also a problem to put the emphasis on the future all the time, because this is still a way of being stuck in the linear way. And maybe if we would more focus in the present, I mean the so-called present, we could understand that maybe this distinction does not really exist in other cosmo-epistemologies. So maybe we could just get rid of this distinction between past, present, and future. I don't know. This is just the flow of my thinking. And Louis Rogout, you want to react? Your microphone, please.
Okay, my microphone.
Yeah, so good.
Yes. Thank you very much. I've heard many things that are really sound as for psychopolitics, where I think that it is Simon Zanelli who said that complex, he spoke about complex of inferiority, that is a sort of self-devaluation. I would like to know if it isn't because of they take now colonial domination as a scapegoat to the point that they refuse to recognize their own responsibility as for what they are experiencing. So self-devaluation isn't due to the fact that they consider colonial domination as a scapegoat so as to belittle their own responsibility. That is my question.
I don't really know. I tend to think that the intensity of the colonial counter, and this is again a temporal question, kind of impedes the possibility to reason in these terms. I mean, the construction, Stern by Fanon, of such a colonial trauma impedes to pose this question of scapegoat and responsibility and self-responsibility, because you have an event that it's of such an intensive magnitude that prevents people to think about this issue. That's what I would say. So inferiority complex becomes entirely when it's framed as innate, that's inevitable, and so on. It's entirely a Western construction. Only when we can comprehend it adequately, only during Fanon's operation of dislocation. But at that point, the operation of temporal dislocation that Fanon does presuppose the fact that the colonial encounter is such an event of such a magnitude that prevents to pose such questions, which are undoubtedly important to pose, but in a certain context, I think it's not possible for the amount of violence, probably devastation.
Thank you very much, everybody. We need to conclude. Sorry, since the next panel is happening in the same webinar, but we can continue the discussion with the